everyone! Today we need to talk about logical outlines. These are perhaps the assignment that matter most to me as a teacher when it comes to teaching writing. Most of you have probably been shown how to do an outline before. If you're like my past students, when you think of an outline, you think of something a little bit like this. At the top of a page, you have a thesis that's a position on a topic like drugs should be legalized. Below you have 3 main points, and each one of those has a couple of examples, facts about those examples, maybe a few just general ideas, all in bullet point form. Each point supports the thesis in a very different way, like having 1 point be about crime rates, 1 point about the economy, and 1 point about public health. However, this is not a logical outline, and it is not what I want you to do. A logical outline will look superficially like a regular outline at first glance, but there are some major differences. The first thing that I want you to notice is that I want you to start with a question, not a thesis. If you're really using writing to learn something or to dialogue with an ongoing conversation instead of just reaching a predetermined conclusion, your outline needs to reflect that by focusing on the question or conversation that you are entering. We'll talk a little bit more about the type of question you will want to use in a little bit. A logical outline is also going to be a bit more than vague bullet points. It's going to require full sentences and sometimes paragraphs throughout the outline. There might be times when you can get away with simplistic bullet points occasionally, but a logical outline works better if you aim for more substance. Evidence is the next thing you want to be thinking about. It's a crucial part of your outline, really in a lot of ways the backbone of it. But it doesn't need to just be basic facts. You can absolutely use empirical data, quotations, examples, other people's arguments or research, personal experience, hypothetical examples, metaphors, and I could go on. Which of these you use depends a lot on the kind of argument you're making and who your audience is and what they expect from your paper. Some assignments will demand empirical data, and a personal experience or metaphor might not be appropriate very often. In other cases, you'll want a mix of various different things. In addition to the evidence that you want to use, and this is one of the things that really differentiates a logical outline from a traditional one, is I expect to see commentary, substantive commentary on the vast majority of your evidence. The commentary should explain what you think about the evidence and directly connect the evidence back to either the main point that it's under or the overarching question. Now, the number of points should be determined by the complexity of your argument. There is no set required number. I've seen successful outlines that had 2 main points and 4 subpoints each, and others that had 4 or 5 main points that built on each other over the course of the essay. I do want to say that if you choose to just have 3 main points, be really careful that you aren't falling back into the trap of choosing 3 kind of semi-random things that do support your thesis, but don't have connections to one another. That's a good sign that you've fallen back into the habit of a 5-paragraph essay. The more important thing is that you have purpose and connection between your points. The final way that a logical outline differs from a traditional one is that it ends with some possible conclusions or answers to the question that you started with, all based on what you provided in your outline. In other words, this section should summarize how all your points add up to an answer. And that's basically what a thesis is an answer to your question. So in other words, the logical outline is more in-depth than a typical outline, and it inverts the structure slightly so that you start with a question and only end with your thesis. So what happens when you use a logical outline instead of a typical one, at least for most students? I think one of my former students explains it pretty well. And this is what he wrote when I asked them for a reflection on what they had learned over the semester. I think the most important thing I took away from this class is that logical outlines might take a lot of time, but they are the most helpful thing I can use when writing a paper. When we were told to do a logical outline, I thought it was just a waste of time like the outlines I did in high school. I've never been so wrong. The logical outline broke everything down and made it a lot easier to write the paper. I think I put more time into my logical outline than I did on my actual paper, but the paper was so much better for it. I've started using the outline for my papers in my other classes, and my teachers have already commented that my papers make more sense. Okay, so let's go back and talk a little bit more about some of these different pieces of the outline. We especially need to talk about the question. I've given you a big question to answer in the assignment sheet, but I've also told you that you need to figure out your own version of this question. There are a couple of different parts to this. First, you want to make your question specific to what you want to focus on. This can be hard. It's one of the reasons why I make students do some free writing or brainstorming before we even get to this stage. Writing about a single example or creating a fact idea list can help you figure out something narrower that you want to focus on. The second thing you want to do is make sure your new version of the question is debatable and will push you beyond just yes or no. The best questions aren't so simplistic there are only two answers, and they are ones that reasonable people could either disagree or agree with you on. That means instead of asking what questions, you'll be asking how or why questions. The final thing is that the best questions will also provide background for each student's alteration of the question. Is there some fact or experience that helps you put your own spin on the question? Is there some theory or approach that you want to bring to bear on it? Explain a little bit about that background, just as you might in the introduction to a paper. This is kind of the equivalent of rewriting the premise section of the assignment sheet. So here's a sample prompt and question that I used last spring in my law and social justice class. We watched a TED Talk and read portions of Bryan Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, in which he talks about how we usually only ask if a person deserves the punishment they receive for a crime, but he thinks we also need to ask whether we deserve to kill, given our country's long history of convicting and executing people who are innocent, particularly people of color. The prompt then asks students to consider, quote, to what extent should we consider not just whether criminals deserve punishment, especially capital punishment, but whether society deserves to enact certain punishments. In other words, I was asking them to evaluate Stevenson's claim. There were a lot of different angles students could take on this issue, and I just want to show you one of them and show you how it kind of works through what I was just laying out in terms of what makes a good question. So this is a sample student revision of the question. You can see it's actually a lot longer than the original. So this is what my student wrote. In his TED Talk, Bryan Stevenson raises the question of whether or not we, as a society, deserve to kill. Philosophers Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Rousseau formed a philosophical theory of the formation of the political and legal society as a result of the existence of a social contract, in which citizens agree to surrender some of the rights they would have in an entirely free society, he calls it a state of nature, to some form of government in order to be protected from war and violence that may exist in high amounts in the state of nature. How does the main assumption of social contract theory help us consider the question of whether or not the state deserves to kill as a form of punishment? If you look at this, the very first sentence is essentially thinking about the original premise of the prompt. It's thinking about the conversation that started the question that this paper was asking students to complete in the first place. So it references Bryan Stevenson. And then it goes on a little bit of a tangent, but it's creating that background for the question that the student really wants to wrestle with. It's saying, okay, I need to lay out what I think social contract theory is so that people know what I'm talking about when I'm saying why, when I'm asking this question. And then the question itself is a how question and not a what question. It's not what is the basis of social contract theory. It's how does the main assumption of social contract theory help us consider the question of whether or not the state deserves to kill as a form of punishment. Okay, so we can see that all three of those different things, we said, okay, give some background, make it specific, right? And of course, it's really debatable, right? It's already suggesting that there might be multiple options or answers to this different question. So once you have your question, you're going to want to actually return to brainstorming. This can take a number of different forms. It can mean just writing down all the ideas you have in free writing, whether as if it was you were writing a draft or even scribbling notes. It can be doing another more focused fact idea list. You could try mind mapping out concepts. We haven't covered that in class yet, but we will do it later this semester. You also want to ask yourself, what additional questions might you need to answer the big question, which can sometimes lead to more effective points and subpoints, which we're going to talk about when we get to arrangement. Once you have your brainstorming materials, you're going to have to do the most important part of this whole process, and that's think. If you're laughing, I'm hoping it's because you think I'm stating the obvious, but it really can be difficult. If you have so many different facts and ideas and lists and random thoughts, how do you pull it all together? There's no one answer to that. Every person can be different. But here are a few questions I tend to ask myself when I'm looking at the combination of the question and my brainstorming materials. The first thing I do is look for patterns and connections. Those patterns and connections can help me to decide what information goes together, what order points should go in. I especially look for things like chronology, patterns, chronology patterns, causes and effect, similarities and contrasts, and hierarchies. All of those things help me see where I have the best groups of ideas that might go together. Then I think about tensions, places where one set of information or ideas seem to conflict with another, or what the most debatable or contentious ideas are. Those are the places where I might be able to say something interesting to an audience. And it doesn't even matter if I already have an idea about like what a solution is or what the right answer is. Sometimes it's better if I don't. But I also think about what matters to me, because either those are the things that might matter to my audience, or they might be the things that I need to convince my audience of. I also look for where I'm uncertain, or where I'm pretty sure I'm guessing or intuiting something, rather than knowing it for sure. These are the places where I either need to think more or need to do some research. And then finally, I always ask myself, is this brainstorm moving me towards answering the question? If it isn't, but it still seems to be answering the overarching prompt, then I might go back and revise my version of the question. If it's not helping answer the prompt, then I cut it out or put it off to the side until I can figure out where it fits. So once you do the thinking, it might be necessary to repeat the process, starting with revising the question, brainstorming some more, and then thinking some more. So think of this as a recursive process where at any point you might go back and start over, or even just go back to one stage previous. Once I figured out the things I want to focus on, I start by arranging them into an outline, deciding on an order. One of the best things about using a logical outline instead of going straight into a draft is that, unlike moving straight into writing full paragraphs in a draft, if you change your mind about the order, it's much easier to move things around by cutting and pasting in the Word document. That can really help you create stronger organization and flow, which a lot of you mentioned was something you wanted to work on, because you don't have to rewrite transitions every time you move a paragraph, and you're more likely to feel comfortable moving ideas around because they don't have those transitions yet. Many times, the order of your ideas that you need to process might already be in your question. For example, in the question we looked at earlier, you can already see the order in which ideas could be considered. It's not the only way to go about answering the question, but you can see that first the writer does have to talk about what the main assumption of social contract theory is. That would be the first thing. Then they have to talk about how the social contract implements punishment in general, and then finally consider how punishment, killing might be the same or different from other kinds of punishment within the social contract. Even though these are three main points, they aren't separate reasons for a single answer to the question, but rather a progressive development of ideas. You'll notice that the progression I'm talking about might not be described best as a series of points, but actually almost a series of smaller questions. And it is perfectly fine to list questions instead of topics or points for your point headings in the outline. Another strategy you can use when you're arranging is to go back to those patterns you were thinking about in the brainstorming stage. Elements like chronology and hierarchy are often the most useful for deciding on an arrangement. So let's just recap. A logical outline is going to start with a question, not a thesis. It will be more in-depth than a traditional bulleted outline, using full sentences and paragraphs for the most part. It will use a variety of pieces of evidence and have commentary that explains each piece of evidence and connects it to other parts of the outline. It will already start to think about the reasoning behind the order of the points. And finally, it will answer the question clearly and directly in what will become a thesis statement. We're going to have some model outlines that are going to walk you through exactly what your options are in this sense, so make sure you check Blackboard and take a look at those.